We have now come to the final session in today's program. Our Fireside chat will tackle issues on driving ESG adoption in ASEAN, from policies to regulatory requirements and economic underpinnings. Leading the Fireside chat is Mr. Yang Eugene, partner, RHD Law Asia. Eugene is a partner and co-head of RHD Law Asia's corporate and capital markets practice and head of the education industry group. He has covered a wide spectrum of corporate and securities law-related work and advised many local and foreign enterprises seeking IPOs, post-listing corporate action, and fundraising activities on the SGX. He also has experience in corporate banking, project financing, fund management, private equity, mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, and corporate restructurings, as well as regulatory and compliance matters, including regulatory requirements under the Securities and Futures Act and the Financial Advisors Act. Together with Eugene, we have David Harley, partner, holding Redlick, Christine Cherisiao, partner, V&A Law, and Sang-Bong Lee, head of ESG Advisory Group, DR and Arju, South Korea. Fire away, Eugene.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Imelda, for the introduction to myself and all my distinguished panelists. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for staying here to the final session of today's forum. And the topic here is driving ESG adoption in the Asia-Pacific region. So today we've selected four unique jurisdictions, whereby they will be sharing their perspectives on what is it in their respective jurisdictions that drive ESG adoption. It may not be the same for everyone, but I think we have a panelist of people here who are very well placed to cover this topic. So as Imelda had mentioned, we have David Harley from Holding Redlick in Australia. We have Ms. Christine Cherisiao from V&A in the Philippines. And we have Mr. Lee Sang-Bong from DR and AJU in South Korea. So I think perhaps I would just kick this session off with the perspective here in Singapore. And so could I have my materials up? Thank you very much. So I suppose in Singapore here, whether you like it or not, a lot of it is actually driven by government initiatives and government regulation. It's a bit difficult for just civil society or just the public to drive a lot of initiatives in a very major way. That may not be the same for every jurisdiction, but certainly in Singapore, that is a big driver of a lot of development that we have here. And in ESG, it is no different. So I think over the years, there's always been, ESG over the last decade has certainly taken on greater and greater prominence. And I can remember back in 2016, it seems like a long time ago, it was just 5-6 years ago. That's when, for example, the Stock Exchange of Singapore first started saying, okay, all public listed companies have to do a sustainability report, in addition to the annual report. And that was a big thing. It caused a big stir, and it spawned an entire industry. And a lot of public listed companies were scrambling around, trying to figure out how to do these things, and even to learn the terminology, learn what these various standards are that they have to now adhere to and report on. It caused a huge stir. That's in 2016. But of course, in the past 5 years, I think a lot of public listed companies have gotten into the act. And I think everyone now is quite comfortable with this idea. But it wouldn't have happened had the stock exchange not said, okay, from a certain point onwards, it's going to be mandatory reporting. And that's what they did. And therefore it just drove behavior, And then, of course, even for example, some of the banks, over the years, they've started to say that, yes, we will start offering, loans which are sustainably linked, green loans and things like that with green components here and there, but quite in a piecemeal fashion. And even government agencies themselves, for example, Enterprise Singapore, they have, and they're always promoting trade, of people, wanting to invest, and they also provide grants. They also started with some of their own initiatives. But the big bang actually really happened 2 years ago when we had this Green Plan 2020. So that was when all of a sudden the government came out with this master plan of having 5 key pillars. And these 5 key pillars were creating a city in nature, right? And they said that, over 130 hectares of new parks will be developed. They'll double the annual tree planting rate to 1 million trees by 2030, and they'll increase the area of nature parks by over 50% in Singapore. And as most of you know, Singapore is a small island. So to be able to do that, it's going to be quite an achievement. But that's what they said will be done. And we're 2 years into that, and the government, you can see, is quite serious about that. The second pillar was sustainable living, to reduce landfill waste per capita by 20% by 2026 and by 30% by 2030, as well as the other initiatives, for the transport sectors, as was discussed in an earlier panel, and for the education sector as well. And also, of course, to promote a circular economy, which was also covered extensively this morning as well. And the third one, the great energy reset, to reduce energy consumption, improve energy efficiency, and to switch to cleaner forms of energy, such as electric energy for vehicles, which was talked about, and also solar energy for buildings and the greening of buildings and infrastructure. And then to have a green economy where green finance played a key role in the development of Singapore as a leading financial center. And there are more initiatives on that, which I'll cover in a bit. And finally, a resilient future, because the government looked ahead 100 years and realized that Singapore might well be underwater. So they said, okay, we need to, protect the coast and develop coastal protection measures all around the island, especially in our southern coast. So they have an ambitious plan to get that done in the next few decades. And also, what's very interestingly, this thing called 30 by 30. By 2030, they want to ensure that we are 30% sustainable in terms of our agricultural produce. Of course, to countries like Australia, that's not a challenge at all. We are more than 100%. We're in surplus. But I think for Singapore, which imports virtually all its edible products, to actually reach 30% in the next 8 years, to be 30% self-sustainable in food, that is a very ambitious plan. So, of course, when this was rolled out 2 years ago, very quickly, in fact, by the end of that very same year, the government actually rolled out 2 key initiatives as well. Just give me a minute, just try to get the slides to move. Yes, which was firstly the ESG, the SG Eco Fund, right, which the Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment said that they'll provide $50 million in funding to green projects. And these are green projects, startup projects by the community to fund sustainability efforts. So, so the Ministry of Environment and Sustainability, which has already been doing things, of course, it's not the first time they're doing it, but they have launched a $50 million fund. And then at the same time, almost in the same month, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the MAS, which is Singapore Central Bank, they launched the Green and Sustainably Linked Loan Grant Scheme, which according to them was a world first, because what they were doing was that they were incentivizing banks to develop frameworks for green and sustainable loans, and they were giving grants to banks to do so, to promote the banks to try and create these loans for, and it is not meant for big businesses, but for SMEs, right? For SMEs and individuals to be able to take loans so that they can fund their own green sustainable initiatives. So in that sense, that drives behavior, because that drives every man in the street to say that, look, I can actually tap funding from the government, that's one source, but also from banks, to fund my initiatives, my small farming, small initiatives. Now, as some of you may know, people turn their rooftops into green farms. So initiatives like that, community gardens, and zero waste, recyclable, circular economy. So this is intended to sort of drive ESG adoption very much in the direction of the people. And I think these initiatives are really intended not just to be top down, but also to promote a ground up effort by people to actually adopt a lot of ESG practices and actually come up with things that actually promote a sustainable and a green living. And finally, um, the government themselves, leading by example, has also come up with the green bond framework. Now, this actually meant government themselves was saying that, okay, government agencies can launch green bonds, but these green bonds need to meet very stringent requirements, and they must go towards 8 key areas, which, as listed there, cover renewable energy, energy efficiency, green buildings, clean transportation, pollution prevention and circular economy, sustainable water and waste management, climate change adoption, and biodiversity conservation and sustainable use of natural resources. Now, if all these sound like I've just said this before, it's because they exactly match what the green plan is. So in other words, the government are issuing bonds right now fund its own drive towards its own green plan 2030. So you can see how the thing sort of hangs together, and they take both a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach. So hopefully in other countries the approach may be different, and maybe I'll now have time to Mr. David Harley to talk about how it is done in Australia, what drives ESG adoption in Australia. David, over to you.
Thanks, Eugen. And hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. It's a great forum. So look, what I wanted to talk about fairly briefly, was three things. One, to give you a snapshot of general ESG themes from an Australian market perspective. And secondly, to look at, provide a bit of an overview of some of the trends here in ESG. And thirdly, just some specific examples of the sort of things that are driving ESG, including government funding incentives. Just by way of background, I'm a projects lawyer, so my exposure to ESG is in energy, waste and social infrastructure projects. So just in terms of general themes from an Australian perspective, ESG is now very prominent here. It's a significant focus for government, the private sector and the community generally. And it was interesting to hear Eugen say that in Singapore it's been the government that, as I understand it, has been the driving force. In Australia, I think particularly in the E space, the environmental space, it's been to a large extent the corporates who are leading the way rather than government. And those corporates have been driven by their investors, financiers and customers and regulatory requirements. So that's been the stick sort of factor, the drive. And conversely, they've been incentivised by government policy in the form of grants and concessional lending, and also the market opportunity, the demand from, the demand and the opportunity in the market to deliver a social or an environmental return, but also an investment return. At the government level, we've got three levels of government in Australia, which has been partly one of the problems from a policy perspective here. And it's been probably more the state and territory governments rather than our federal government that has been more active and leading the way in terms of environmental policy and sustainability and the ecological transformation. I don't think our market is unique in terms of having, increasing focus on ESG, and in some respects we're behind other places like New Zealand and Europe in terms of emission targets and reporting on climate change risk. I think there are probably a couple of distinctive features though that might be influencing market, community and government sentiment here. And maybe the first, I think, is probably just we've got very extensive renewable energy resources in the form of sun and wind, and so there's huge economic potential, and so there's a lot of focus on, that potential to leverage those resources and get into things like green hydrogen and green steel and export that as a source of revenue for the country. I think the second sort of distinctive feature here is that we've got a lot of natural resource wealth and history in fossil fuels and mining, and so that's a very important sector economically. And with that comes the perception of what our contribution to climate change has been and what our responsibility should be in playing a part in transition towards decarbonisation. So that's the second sort of feature I'd mention. Thirdly, there's a lot of class litigation, class actions in Australia. I think we're the most litigious. Last year, we were the most litigious country in the world on a per capita basis. So that's investors, consumers, public advocacy groups bringing actions against both government and corporates for failing to address climate change or act in a socially responsible way. And I think the last feature that sort of is influencing sentiment here is just in the last 2 or 3 years, we've had quite a cycle of devastating bushfires and floods, and I think that's had a bearing on the perception of climate change risk here and what corporates should be doing and are doing and how and what they're reporting on. So that's just a bit of an overview of ESG generally. In terms of the challenges here for corporates in driving ESG, I think government policy has been a challenge with 3 levels of government. There's been inconsistent policy in terms of energy targets, emission targets, recycling, the treatment of waste and that sort of thing. And so I think there's there has been a general perception that we need stronger leadership, particularly at the federal level, in the e-space in particular. And so as a result, you have different frameworks across the country for energy targets, for the treatment of waste, for things like social and affordable housing and governance, different forms of legislation in different states dealing with governance issues like modern slavery. Energy policy is hugely topical here. We had near blackouts in Australia last week because of problems with our grid and the energy market. So policy is at the forefront of everyone's mind in the e-space here at the moment. In the S space, one of the challenges has been in delivering projects that provide a social outcome, whether it's social housing or some form of community benefit, education or health. It's difficult to value in an investment return sense what that outcome is, and I think that's a challenge for investing and financing in projects in the social infrastructure space. So there are some challenges in terms of threats for corporates. I think it may well be increasingly difficult for corporates to access finance and investment where they're not embracing the transition towards decarbonisation and net zero. I think that's a trend to watch. And on an optimistic note, opportunities for the corporates, well, huge opportunity in renewable energy, sustainability, waste management, recycling, and also projects around social housing and accommodation in particular. There's a real shortage of affordable housing in Australia, so that's very topical and a big focus for government and the private sector. There's no shortage of funding sources here. There's a lot of funds, a lot of government funding and debt, a lot of superannuation money as well. So there's no shortage of funding for good projects. So I'd just like to then briefly talk about some general trends And in the S space, there's an increased focus on projects delivering social outcomes. And I think, the rise of socially responsible investment is driving focus of corporates, project sponsors and government towards socially responsible projects. And I think we'll see a lot more of that here in the next 5 to 6 years. And that's in education and health services and infrastructure, integrated precincts that involve transport and other components that deliver some form of community benefit or service. And as I've mentioned, housing and things like build to rent. Some of the policies in that space that are helping to drive investment and activity, there's been tax relief for build to rent projects and social housing. There are urban planning measures which are inclusionary by nature. There are quite a few government funds being set up for housing projects. And transport infrastructure is now being developed as part of a broader integrated hub with other features that benefit the community rather than just a standalone train station or railway network or something like that. I think one thing to note here is, as I mentioned, it's hard to value social returns from social projects. And so the social impact financing market hasn't taken off in the same way as it has, I think, in the E space with climate-based bonds and loans. And that's a challenge because, investors still require a return. So those projects in the social space here really still require heavy government support, whether that's in the form of subsidies, land being gifted to them or given to them at no charge, and favourable tax treatment. So that's the S space. In the E space, which is probably the most developed here, with energy, there's a huge focus now on transmission infrastructure and storage. There are governments on the east coast of Australia which are developing quite ambitious plans for renewable energy zones to try to coordinate all of the development and investment activity. And we have a new federal government here, which is just committed to a higher 2030 emissions reduction target of 43% below 2005 levels by 2030. So there's been some change in policy there as well. There's a lot of activity here, a lot of talk about green hydrogen and green steel, a lot of interest from potential overseas off-takers in places like South Korea and elsewhere, but it's still fairly early days at the moment. And the other thing I think to note in the E space in terms of trends, there is growing focus now on waste management, the circular economy, the waste hierarchy, and how you minimise and avoid waste and avoid landfill because of concerns around methane and CO2 emissions. And I think there's going to be a greater focus too on supply chain emissions. So that's the E space. Just in terms of the G space or governance, there's a greater focus now on governance in projects with separate ESG reporting requirements and metrics, stronger policies at a project-specific level directed towards the particular project and capturing data and reporting on the ESG metrics in the project. There are greater inclusion and diversity frameworks and targets for projects, particularly, for instance, if it involves government procurement and tender processes. There's a move to pass ESG requirements down the supply chain to contractors and suppliers. And, potentially we may be in a position where directors will be required to be certifying compliance with the ESG policies and outcomes from projects, much as they do with, financial statements. So there's some of the trends in the G space, and that's also contributing to increased time and cost in managing projects here. Look, and then lastly, I just wanted to touch on some specific examples of things that are driving the corporates here. So in terms of government policy and funding support, we have, most of the states here have net zero targets by 2050, 50% renewables by 2030. Queensland has a $2 billion renewable energy and hydrogen fund. We have a federal government green bank, the CEFC, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and ARENA, which provide together they provide grant funding and debt funding for renewable projects, and they've been very active in the market, helping to commercialise projects that might not otherwise attract commercial bank support. New South Wales has a sustainability bond for ESG investment. In Victoria and Australia, for instance, in the social infrastructure space, there are PPP projects, public-private partnership projects, for the development of social housing, leveraging the private sector with government support. In terms of market financing investment, the Commonwealth Bank here has just announced $70 billion by way of sustainable finance by 2030 as part of its green, social and sustainability funding framework. We've got things like sustainability linked and green loans to the Port of Newcastle, which is the biggest coal export terminal in the world. And so that was interesting that they've got a loan there that's linked to environmental and sustainability outcomes. In terms of government regulation, we've got, for instance, at the Commonwealth federal level, modern slavery legislation to drive corporates to report on the risk of modern slavery in supply chains and what steps they're taking to manage those risks. ESG is very prominent in government procurement processes, and there's increasing regulatory scrutiny of what corporates are saying in terms of greenwashing. And then look, just lastly, in terms of social licence and stakeholder engagement, as I mentioned, there have been a lot of class actions in Australia, and so that's driving behaviour as well. And so, for instance, just yesterday, there was an action talked about in newspapers here against one of the big gas companies relating to a natural gas project in Western Australia and the potential impact that it will have on the Great Barrier Reef on the other side of the country because of the emissions and consequential global warming. So there are quite novel, class actions and claims being brought against both government and corporates here, and that's another factor driving behaviour. So happy to chat to that later, but that's a perspective on things in Australia. Thanks, Eugene.
David, thank you very much for quite a comprehensive coverage of the various factors driving ESG adoption in Australia. It's very interesting to hear, that actually it's much, much more multifaceted in Australia, and a lot of it is actually driven by social need as well as environmental need, and also the need of investors. That's an interesting perspective. The investors are driving the behavior of corporates, maybe because I think the investment community in Australia could be a bit more active, as in they make their needs known to corporates, what they want, what they expect corporates to do. And of course, we are seeing that certainly in Singapore increasingly here as well. But, I think at the moment anyway, the big push here is still from government. Obviously, in certain aspects, from what I've been hearing you've been saying, in Australia, the government, whether at the state or the federal level, they're actually playing catch up to some of the things that actually, either investors want or that in fact society expects, right? And the government is trying to get legislation around it or trying to drive behavior in a certain way. But actually the need is already there and it's very apparent. Yeah, so thank you very much for sharing your perspective. And maybe now we can move on to Kristen and the Philippines. What drives ESG adoption in the Philippines, which is a chain of 7,000 over islands? It can't be easy to have any kind of uniform perspective, but I'm sure you can give it a good go at what's really driving the change in behavior towards ESG adoption. Christine?
Yes. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christine Chow. I'm a Philippine lawyer specializing in corporate and M&A. I'm a partner in VNA Law, but I also had a brief stint as general counsel in one of the largest renewable energy companies in the Philippines. So ESG has just recently been becoming mainstream for Philippine corporates. although there is a varying level of maturity in terms of ESG integration among businesses in the country. So the ESG trend is due partly to private sector initiative, but it is admittedly largely driven also by government regulations. Just last year, in April 2021, the Philippines submitted its nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC, Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this was developed through a whole of government and society approach. The NDC supports the country's national development objectives and priorities of sustainable industrial development, energy security, and social and climate justice, and also the transformation of its socio-economic sectors to achieve a climate and disaster resilient and low carbon economy. So pursuant to the NDC, the Philippines shall endeavor to peak its emissions by 2030, and the Philippines commits to a projected GHG emissions reduction and avoidance of 75%. This is to accelerate the transition to a green economy. Our country is quite aware of its exposure and vulnerability to climate change impacts, and the increasing losses and damage that the Philippines is incurring because of typhoons and flooding. As such, it is employing its full national political strength to address the problem of climate change. Indeed, much is being done in terms of government action, legislation, and regulations in supporting and driving sustainability and ESG in the Philippines. But for this afternoon, let me focus on just two matters which are quite new in the Philippines: ESG reporting and sustainable finance. So for ESG reporting, since 2016, Philippine publicly listed companies or PLCs have been required to disclose material and reportable non-financial and sustainability issues as part of their annual reportorial obligations. But in 2019, the Philippine SEC issued the Sustainability Reporting Guidelines for PLCs, which makes it mandatory to submit a separate sustainability report for all PLCs. The guidelines have been adopted on a comply or explain approach for the first 3 years. That means from 2020 to 2022. By comply or explain, it means that companies would be required to attach the template to their annual reports, but they can provide explanations for items where they still have no available data on. Sustainability reporting under the guidelines, however, will be mandatory for PLCs beginning next year, 2023. The disclosures are to be made using a reporting template provided in the guidelines, but for companies already reporting in accordance with internationally recognized sustainability frameworks or standards, their sustainability report shall be considered as their compliance. So the reporting template requires disclosures on 4 key topics: economic, environmental, social, and UN sustainability development goals. So the guidelines focuses on economic, environmental, and social disclosures, since governance disclosures are separately provided in the integrated annual corporate governance report, which is also submitted to the SEC. Economic disclosures relate to how the company directly increases the pool of economic resources that flows in the local and national economy, including disclosures on risks and opportunities due to climate change, procurement process practices with respect to local suppliers, and anti-corruption. For environmental disclosures, this would relate to how the company manages natural resources, as well as how it minimizes its negative impact to the environment, including biodiversity. On the disclosures on social topics, this relate to how the organization manages its relationship with its stakeholders, including its employees, customers, suppliers, communities, the public, and the government, and includes disclosures on issues related to human rights, access to and quality of products and services, responsible business practices and marketing, customer privacy, and data security. Disclosures are also required on how companies are able to contribute to the UN SDGs through their products and services. Now, moving to sustainable finance. In the period from 2018 to 2019, the Philippine SEC issued 3 separate guidelines for the issuance of green bonds, sustainability bonds, and social bonds. So these are all under the applicable ASEAN Green Bonds, Sustainability Bonds, and Social Bonds standards. Similar to what Eugene mentioned earlier, eligible green project categories would include renewable energy, energy efficiency, pollution prevention and control, clean transportation, sustainable water, waste water management, climate change adaptation, etc. Fossil fuel power generation projects are expressly identified as ineligible green projects. On the other hand, eligible social project categories would include affordable basic infrastructure, access to essential health, such as essential services such as health and education, affordable housing, employment generation, food security, and socioeconomic advancement and empowerment. Ineligible social projects would involve activities that pose a negative social impact related to alcohol, gambling, tobacco, and weaponry. In relation to both ESG reporting and sustainable finance, the Philippine Central Bank, on the other hand, circularized in 2020 the Sustainable Finance Framework in recognition of the climate-related financial risk and other environmental and social risks that could impact operations and financial interests of banks. So under the circular, banks are expected to embed sustainability principles, including those covering environmental and social risks areas in their corporate governance framework, in their risk management systems, and in their strategic objectives. The Sustainable Finance Framework outlines the new disclosure requirements that banks should include in their annual reports, including its sustainability strategic objectives and risk appetite, an overview of its environmental and social risk management system, the products and services aligned with internationally recognized sustainability standards and practices, including the issuance of green, social, or sustainability bonds, and other information related to environmental and social risks. On this, the central bank provided a transitory provision of 3 years from the effectivity of the circular for the banks to fully comply with the provisions of the circular. If a publicly listed bank already complies with the ESG reporting requirements, the report submitted to the SEC shall be attached to the annual report to be submitted to the central bank to satisfy the disclosure requirements. And just early in February this year, our central bank circularized to all banks in the Philippines the Philippine Sustainable Finance Roadmap and Guiding Principles that sets out a comprehensive approach that will serve as the foundation to facilitate the mainstreaming of sustainable finance in the country. To end I would like to highlight that while the Philippines may not be as advanced in terms of ESG maturity in the market compared to Singapore or Australia and other jurisdictions, and while we know that there is still much work that needs to be done, the commitment to achieving as resilient and low carbon economy through a whole of government approach signals that the country will be moving towards the direction of a green and a socially just future. So thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you very much for that. I think in the Philippines, as in Australia, I think the people can see the need for ESG and sustainable living. The need is there because you actually do face, climate disasters and things that, can only be attributed to climate change. So I think, the drive for corporates in order to adopt, and I can see that, in fact, your disclosure requirements in the Philippines for corporates, and certainly now for banks as well, the latest initiatives is very comprehensive. But I think on top of it being just driven by the government, I suspect the people expect that all these big banks and big corporates, the PLCs, that they have to behave in a socially and environmentally responsible manner because, they are the ones that make a difference, right? Compared to, small businesses or just, the members of the public. So thank you very much for sharing the Philippine perspective. And I think it sounds to me it's well on its journey to having ESG adoption. Okay, and finally now, turning to South Korea, Mr. Lee Sang-bong from DR and AJU, could you please share the perspective, the South Korean perspective? And South Korea is a very advanced, mature society. So I guess the expectations are quite high from your jurisdiction. Mr. Lee, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sang-bong Lee at AJU LLC in Seoul. It is my honor to take part in this seminar, and I'd like to introduce shortly on our government's ESG policy. And last year we had a substantial change in terms of ESG. Our government submitted the NDC last year to the UN. According to our government's NDC, our government is aimed to decrease the quantity of greenhouse gas emission 7 million tons in 2018 to 400 million tons by 2030. I think it is a very big challenge to many companies and our government. And second, our government has enacted carbon neutral act, which is aimed to carbon neutral by 2050, and it regulates many aspects of carbon greenhouse gas emission, including greenhouse gas trading system and governmental support to supports the industry. And second, our government has big interest in industrial safety. We have experienced many industrial accidents last year, and so our government has enacted a new law which is promotes the safe system, safe management system of our every companies, and it also regulates the reporting, disclosure, and disclosure of the any safety management system. And yeah, and thirdly, our Korean government will adopt sustainability report disclosure in 2025. At this moment, the sustainable report is not mandatory for public companies, but public listed companies. But in 2025, it will be mandatory for mostly public listed companies in Korea. So this sustainability report disclosure system will change many aspects of our Korean companies, including environmental, social, and government. These days, our ESG management system, ESG management was focused by especially large companies, including Samsung, LG, or Hyundai Motors, and those companies have installed ESG management committees, and through the committees, those companies are adopting many new systems to cope with the ESG challenge or risk. And lastly, I want to introduce Korean government's action for due diligence in supply chain. Korean government is focusing on the due diligence in supply chain, and it is endeavoring to make many new standards in ESG, and to educate or support the small and medium enterprises to cope with the ESG due diligence risk. Yeah, I think the Korean government thinks the decrease of carbon emission is the big challenge for Korean government and companies, because Korea has many heavy industry companies, including Samsung or Hyundai, and I think this challenge may lead to many companies to develop new process or other transition. Also may lead to pursue other transition. Yeah. I think yes.
Or
yeah. Yes.
All right, Mr. Lee, thank you very much for sharing the South Korean perspective. And I have to say, I mean, when I first heard 400 million tons by 2030, that is a very, very ambitious objective of reduction in terms of carbon emissions. That's in 8 years' time, right? So I think that is very ambitious.
Yeah.
But I mean, I suppose given the power and the prevalence of a lot of, as you say, very big companies, right, in South Korea, in the various fields, but very, very large conglomerates and companies, which are all international companies,
Yeah.
driving, industry for them to bring it down to these levels, right? I think it would make a big difference because of the dominance of a lot of these large companies. So in a way, if the government focuses on them, I think it will really, what we call, move the needle. It will help make a difference in terms of the economy. What's also very interesting to hear is that they are also providing support for the SMEs. And this thing about, um, due diligence on the supply chain, I think that is an extremely important component, really, on terms of ESG, because it's not, I mean, as you know, to manufacture anything, right? The final product that comes out, probably there's an entire, chain of processes that first had to go through, and a lot of companies had to get to that final product. Sometimes, in fact, as with a lot of American companies and other companies, the final product is just a branding exercise, because the thing which was put together is put together by, an army of different companies supplying different parts, right? And that's why you also have, certainly in China, you've got a lot of these fake OEM. They're not fake, they are actually the same thing, just not, given the very flashy label and, charging half the price for it. But the point is that this thing about due diligence on the supply chain, and I suspect that a lot of your very big companies already have that process. I am sure that they are probably already looking down in terms of all their suppliers and vendors and making them comply, with their ESG requirements. But I think certainly the small and medium enterprises will not have the resources to police and monitor that. And also, they won't have the same amount of clout. I mean, as you said, if Samsung or Hyundai tells the supplier to do something, the supplier will definitely do the bend over backwards, they'll throw resources in, they'll do whatever it takes to comply with what Samsung or Hyundai or, one of your big companies, demand. But the thing is, your small and medium enterprises, they will not have the same clout. So if the government can provide the same kind of support to them to make it mandatory, and provide not just make it mandatory for the SME, but to help them along, provide funding, for example, for them to police their suppliers down the chain, then it's going to have a much more meaningful impact. So I think it's quite clear that I think the South Korean government recognizes what are the things that it takes, what are the various parts of it where if you make those parts move, it will create the biggest impact in terms of ESG adoption. And one big thing is, of course, the reduction in carbon emission in South Korea. So I think it's very clear that every country, every jurisdiction has to do what is appropriate in its own country. There's no one size fits all, as you can see from today's presentation. The drive, the impetus, for ESG adoption it can be quite different for different countries, and it really has to fit into the local economy and the local society. And I think that's something, in a way, we also hope that a lot of investors that, a lot of, say, Western investors that come into Asia, I hope they also understand that, in the sense that, if they take a one-size-fits-all approach, that every company, every business they invest into has to tick these same boxes in equal weightage, it doesn't make sense, because it's different for different countries and for different industries within those countries themselves. So in a way, we hope hope also the investment community will also take a more nuanced approach and, you know, sort of put the demands where it actually makes a difference in that country, in that jurisdiction, and not say, you know, that, okay, this standard I want across all my investee companies across the world. It doesn't work like that, you know, and I think that's where the most impact can be made if each country is sensitive to what its needs are and what will make a difference. And again, coming back to Singapore, in a way, maybe we're a little bit fortunate. We do not yet have, you know, natural disasters, you know, and in terms of industry, unlike South Korea, none of our companies are the same size in terms of, you know, manufacturing companies for sure, you know, as anything in South Korea. So the government has to take a lead. It has to drive the behavior of the people and of the companies to say you have to adopt these certain standards, because otherwise the needle is probably not going to move very far. But thank you all very much for sharing your unique perspectives on ESG adoption in your countries. I think we have a few minutes left. I maybe just want to throw it out to the production team as to whether there are any queries that have been raised by the floor, by the audience. I do not see any in the chat box. Have there been any queries from any members of the audience? If not, then maybe just a few parting words from each of our speakers again. Maybe, you know, just starting back from David again in Australia. Where do you see the future of ESG adoption to be? I mean, where do you see, you know, where the biggest changes are going to lie in the coming years in your country?
I think there'll be a lot more development, Eugene, in projects with social outcomes. Particularly, I mentioned social and affordable housing, disability accommodation. I think that'll be an area, but investors and corporates need to work out how to value those social outcomes, and government too, how to value a social outcome, because so that, you know, the return is there. And so I think there's going to be more focus on collecting data and looking at the metrics and reporting and trying to extract some sense of what the value is. There's going to be, I think, more focus on the supply chain in terms of the Scope 3 emissions. I think that will be a big focus. And I think the other interesting thing to mention here is even within the environmental space, where projects are delivering good outcomes, there are still a lot of tensions here with competing land uses and resource sustainability. So people would like to produce a lot of hydrogen, but that will require a lot of land and a lot of water, and that competes with farming and other agricultural uses. So there are some tensions there, and so social license is very important for projects here.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so the social dimension is very important. Emissions, as well as competing land use, which I mean, if that's a challenge for a very large country like Australia, I can imagine for smaller countries it'll be even a bigger challenge. Thank you very much. Maybe Kristen, where do you see the immediate future of ESG? Where are the big changes you think will be coming up in the years to come?
Well, I think there's really pressure to, you know, adopt ESG standards in how we do things, not just by corporates, but as a country, or the entire world. In fact, we are one big global supply chain, and our actions affect each other. So when there's pressure from, for example, your customers, for you to adhere to environmentally safe practices, ethical practices, then that really drives the change in attitude, change in policy, change in practices. And as they say, nobody gets left behind. And I guess that means that it's also everybody's job to move all the sustainability development goals forward. So I think it's going to be just a few. Some are a few steps ahead, but everybody is catching up, so that we all contribute to the sustainability development goals.
Thank you, Kristen. Very well put. We are one global climate and we are one global supply chain, despite maybe what some people like to think. And maybe from Mr. Lee, some final words from you. Anything about your thoughts for South Korea? You can continue. Just a few parting words of wisdom.
Yeah. Thank you. This year we had a presidential election in Korea, and new government term begins since May. And according to the recent announcement of our government, our government will focus on nuclear power plant to decrease the greenhouse gas emission. Our government thinks solar panel or windmill power plant cannot substitute the conventional power plant, and so to avoid the energy risk, our government will renew rebuild the nuclear power plant project. Yeah. This is the most notable policy in Korea, I think.
Okay, which is slightly, just very slightly controversial, in a sense that, but it could. I mean, if it's ensured to be safe, it could well solve a lot of energy problems. But I guess safety is paramount. But well, all the best, to the initiative from the South Korean government. And maybe it's a model for the rest of the countries to follow, including Singapore. Put a nuclear power plant right in our island here. Thank you all. Thank you once again for taking part in today's session. I think it has been very wide-ranging and very, very informative. And I hope the audience has found it the same. And I think that just leaves me to thank everyone. Then we'll hand the session back to the chair. Thank you very much. Thank you all.